opening a fire kindled in ice. The wind howled through the jagged peaks of the Etheran mountains, carrying a chill that bit into flesh and bone, as if the very sky mourned in silence. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, swirling through the air like fragments of shattered memories. In the heart of a desolate, frost-covered plaza carved from the ancient stone of the northern realm, two black steel coffins rested on raised platforms. Their surfaces bore the deep-etched sigil of a red eagle, the proud emblem of the Stormville clan, once the beacon of honor in the north. Tattered mourning banners, emblazoned with the same eagle, fluttered weakly in the gale, their edges frayed like the remnants of a glory long faded. A small gathering of nobles and elders stood at a distance, clad in fur-lined cloaks, their faces as cold and unyielding as the ice around them. Their whispers, though soft, cut through the wind, sharp and venomous like blades hidden beneath the snow. At the forefront of the plaza, isolated from the crowd, stood a boy of 15. Jack, the last heir of Stormville, wore a threadbare cloak, its one stark fabric faded to a ghostly gray. His thin arms clutched a wooden sword, the final keepsake from his father, its surface worn smooth by years of devotion. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but his jaw was set, defying the cold and the weight of the eyes upon him. His breath formed fleeting clouds of mist, dissolving into the frigid air. This was the funeral of his parents, the North's most renowned warriors, yet no tears fell, no words of farewell were spoken, no shoulder offered solace. Only silence prevailed, as cold as the ice encasing the coffins, as heavy as the grief in Jack's heart. The nobles' whispers grew bolder, their words laced with disdain. "No bludgift," one muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "He cannot summon the sword soul, a stain on Stormvale's name." Another, a woman with a thin smile, added, "His parents died as heroes, yet their blood bore a weakling. What a pity." Jack heard every word. His grip tightened on the wooden sword, knuckles whitening, but he did not turn, did not speak. His eyes remained fixed on the coffins, where gray-clad warriors began sealing the steel with layers of ice. The clank of metal against stone rang out, hollow and final, like a death knell echoing through the plaza. One by one, the crowd dispersed. Some nobles bowed briefly to the coffins, a perfunctory gesture, but their glances slid past Jack as if he were invisible. A young lord, passing close, deliberately brushed against Jack's shoulder, nearly knocking him off balance. The lord smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes, and strode away, leaving Jack trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of solitude and scorn. The plaza emptied, leaving only Jack and the two steel graves, now fully encased in ice, gleaming dully under the gray sky. He stepped forward, his boots crunching in the snow, and knelt beside the coffins. His small hand, red and chapped from the cold, rested on the frozen steel, tracing the red eagle sigil. His eyes were dry, not because he felt no pain, but because his grief had grown too vast for tears. His voice, hoarse and strained, broke the silence. "I won't cry," he whispered, the words trembling but resolute. "Tears can't bring you back, but I swear I will reclaim our honor. I will make them pay, with my blood, my will, with these hands. I will return, not as the outcast they scorn, but as the one who brings the North to its knees." A sudden gust tore through the plaza, scattering the snow that had settled on his wooden sword, revealing the faint eagle carving on its hilt. High above, a lone eagle circled the ashen sky, its piercing cry cutting through the wind before it vanished into the heavy clouds. Jack's eyes, once clouded with sorrow, flickered with a new light, not the gaze of a boy seeking forgiveness, but the stare of a soul betrayed, ready to forge itself anew. In that moment, a fire kindled in his shattered heart, a flame of vengeance, of justice, of a name erased but not extinguished. It was a fire that would burn through the ice of the North, a promise that would shake the foundations of Stormvale. 3 days later, the ancient stone hall of the Stormville clan loomed under the flickering light of torches. Its walls, carved with reliefs of warriors wielding swords and shields, told tales of a lineage that had once commanded the North's respect. But today, the hall felt hollow, its warmth drained by the chill of betrayal. The torches burned low, casting long shadows that danced like specters of a fading legacy. Jack stood in the center of the hall, still clad in his tattered cloak, his eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. The wooden sword was gone, replaced by the broken eagle sigil, clutched tightly in his hand, its edges cutting into his palm. Before him sat the council of elders, perched on high stone chairs etched with the red eagle. Their faces were stern, their fur cloaks a stark contrast to Jack's ragged attire. At their head was Magnus, his father's elder brother, a towering man with silver hair and a beard as white as the snow outside. His eyes, cold and unyielding, bore into Jack, not as family, but as a stranger, or worse, a blemish to be erased. The other elders, their expressions a mix of contempt and indifference, sat in silence. No one addressed Jack as the heir, no one offered him a seat. He stood alone, a solitary figure in a hall that had once been his home. Magnus rose, his voice deep and resonant, echoing off the stone like a judgment from the gods. "Jack, son of Stormville," he began, each word heavy with finality, "you bear no bloodgift, no sword soul, no victories in the training yard. You are a shame to this clan. A lineage of warriors feared across the north cannot be led by the weak. You are unworthy of the name Stormville." The words landed like blows, and whispers rippled through the hall. Some elders nodded, their agreement cold and mechanical. A noble in the back smirked, his eyes glinting with disdain. Jack stood still, his gaze locked on Magnus, not pleading but memorizing every line of the man's face, the face of the one who would sever his ties to kin. He knew this was no debate, no chance to speak. This was a ritual, a scripted act to erase him from the clan's history. Magnus raised a hand, and a group of warriors in gray armor stepped forward, their faces hidden behind steel visors. One tore the eagle's sigil from Jack's cloak, tossing it to the stone floor with a metallic clink. The sigil skidded, its silver surface catching the torchlight, a broken relic of honor discarded like refuse. Another warrior shoved Jack's shoulder, forcing him to his knees. Pain shot through his body as he hit the cold stone, but he made no sound. Slowly, he reached for the sigil, closing his fingers around it, blood seeping from his palm where the sharp edges bit into skin. The hall was silent, not a single hand extended to help, not a single glance of pity. Magnus spoke again, his voice devoid of warmth. "By the will of the council, you are stripped of your title as heir, erased from the Stormville lineage. From this day, you are forbidden to set foot on ancestral lands. You are no longer one of us." The verdict was final, a blade severing the last thread tying Jack to his family, his home. The gray-clad warriors seized his arms, pulling him to his feet and dragging him from the hall. Jack did not resist. He walked back straight, eyes never leaving Magnus, as if to say that while they could take his name, they could not break his will. The path to the city gates was lined with snow, the cold seeping through Jack's worn boots. Townsfolk gathered along the streets, whispering and pointing. Some shook their heads, their eyes a mix of pity and scorn. "The useless boy," a blacksmith muttered. "Is this how Stormville's bloodline ends?" Another voice hissed. Jack heard but did not turn. He passed the streets he once knew, where he had played under his parents' watchful eyes, where laughter had once echoed from the ancestral hall. Now those homes were shuttered, those faces turned away, as if he were a ghost unworthy of notice. The massive stone gates of Stormville loomed ahead, their surface carved with the red eagle, its wings spread in defiance. The gates groaned open, a low rumble like the growl of a beast, and slammed shut behind Jack with a thud that reverberated in his chest. He stood outside, the wind whipping his face, snow clinging to his cloak and dark hair. He had no belongings, no horse, no coin, only the broken sigil in his hand and the oath he had sworn. The snow fell thicker, the world a blur of white and gray. Jack raised his eyes to the sky, unyielding despite the sting of the cold. There was nothing left behind him to mourn. From this moment, Jack Stormville ceased to exist. But within him, a new name was taking shape, a name that would return not to beg forgiveness, but to bring the proud to their knees. Chapter 1: Exile and Despair. The stone hall of the Stormville clan loomed cold and cavernous, its ancient walls etched with reliefs of warriors brandishing swords and shields, their faces frozen in eternal triumph. But on this day, 3 days after the silent funeral of Jack's parents, the hall held no warmth, no glory. The torches lining the walls burned low, their flickering light casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to mock the fading legacy of the clan. Jack, 15 years old, stood alone in the center of the hall, his threadbare cloak hanging loosely over his thin frame. His eyes, shadowed from sleepless nights, bore the weight of grief, but his chin was raised, defiant against the judgment he knew awaited. In his hand, he clutched the broken eagle sigil, its sharp edges digging into his palm, a remnant of the honor torn from him at his parents' graves. Before him sat the council of elders, perched on high stone chairs carved with the red eagle of Stormvale, a symbol of power and pride now turned against its own blood. Their fur-lined cloaks contrasted sharply with Jack's ragged attire, their stern faces a gallery of contempt and indifference. At their head was Magnus, his father's elder brother, a towering figure with silver hair and a beard as white as the snow that blanketed the north. His eyes, cold and unyielding, regarded Jack not as kin, but as a flaw to be excised. The other elders sat in silence, their gazes shifting between disdain and disinterest. No one addressed Jack as the heir, no one offered him a seat. He stood solitary, a frail silhouette in a hall that had once echoed with the laughter of his childhood. Magnus rose, his voice deep and resonant, reverberating off the stone like a decree from the heavens. "Jack, son of Stormvale," he began, each word heavy with condemnation, "you bear no bludgift, no sword soul, no victories in the training yard. You are a disgrace to this clan. A lineage of warriors, revered and feared across the north, cannot be led by the weak. You are unworthy of the name Stormvale." The words struck like hammer blows, and a ripple of whispers spread through the hall. Some elders nodded, their agreement cold and mechanical. A noble in the shadows smirked, his eyes glinting with malice. Jack stood motionless, his gaze locked on Magnus, not with a plea, but with a silent resolve to etch every detail of this moment into his memory, the face of the man who would sever his ties to his family. He knew this was no trial, no chance for defense. This was a ritual, a calculated act to erase him from the clan's legacy. Magnus raised a hand, and a group of warriors in gray armor stepped forward, their faces obscured by steel visors, their movements precise and unfeeling. One reached for the tattered cloak on Jack's shoulder, ripping away the last eagle sigil pinned there. The silver emblem clattered to the stone floor, its faint gleam catching the torchlight like a dying star. It skidded to a stop, a broken relic of honor discarded as refuse. Another warrior shoved Jack's shoulder, forcing him to his knees. Pain flared as his knees struck the cold stone, but he made no sound. Slowly, he reached for the fallen sigil, his fingers closing around it, blood seeping from his palm where the jagged edges bit into his skin. The hall was silent, not a single hand offered aid, not a single glance held pity. Magnus spoke again, his voice devoid of warmth, as final as the closing of a tomb. "By the will of the council, you are stripped of your title as heir, erased from the Stormvale lineage. From this day, you are forbidden to set foot on ancestral lands. You are no longer one of us." The verdict was a blade, severing the last thread tying Jack to his home, his family, his name. The gray-clad warriors seized his arms, hauling him to his feet and dragging him toward the hall's massive doors. Jack did not resist. He walked, his back straight, his eyes never leaving Magnus, as if to declare that while they could take his title, they could not break his spirit. The path to the city gates wound through streets blanketed in snow, the cold seeping through Jack's worn boots, numbing his feet with each step. Townsfolk lined the way, their whispers a low hum beneath the wind. Some shook their heads, their eyes a mix of pity and scorn. "The useless boy," a baker muttered, his voice carrying on the breeze. "Is this the end of Stormville's blood?" a woman hissed nearby. Jack heard but did not turn. He passed the familiar streets where he had once run as a child, chasing shadows under his parents' watchful eyes where the ancestral hall had rung with tales of valor. Now those homes were shuttered, those faces averted, as if he were a specter unworthy of acknowledgement. The great stone gates of Stormville towered ahead, their surfaces carved with the red eagle, its wings spread in defiance. The gates groaned open, a low rumble like the growl of a wounded beast, and slammed shut behind Jack with a thud that echoed in his chest. He stood alone outside, the wind lashing his face, snow clinging to his cloak and dark hair. He carried no belongings, no horse, no coin, only the broken sigil in his hand and the oath he had sworn by his parents' graves. The snow fell thicker, the world blurring into a haze of white and gray. Jack lifted his eyes to the leaden sky, unyielding despite the sting of the cold. There was nothing left behind to mourn. From this moment, Jack Stormville ceased to exist. But within him, a new resolve was taking shape, a vow that would return not to beg mercy, but to bring the mighty to their knees. The early days of exile were a relentless trial, each step a battle against a world that seemed determined to crush him. Jack wandered the snow-dusted roads of the Midlands, his boots leaking with every trudging step, the cold biting into his soles like shards of glass. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a constant companion that grew sharper with each passing day. He approached small villages, standing by roadside stalls, his trembling hands outstretched for a scrap of stale bread. But the eyes that met his were wary, then scornful. "Get lost, urchin," a vendor barked, waving him off as one might a stray dog. Once an old woman tossed him a moldy crust, but as he bent to retrieve it, village children jeered, pelting him with stones. Jack did not retaliate. He clutched the broken eagle sigil in his pocket, straightened his back, and walked on, though his body ached with every bruise. At night, he sought shelter wherever he could, beneath the icy overhang of a stone bridge, in abandoned stables reeking of rot, or among piles of moldy straw in forgotten fields. The wind pierced his cloak, chilling his bones, and sleep came in fitful snatches, haunted by memories of the funeral, the hall, the gates. Hunger woke him often, his stomach twisting until he curled into himself, clutching the sigil as if it could anchor him. In the darkest hours, he whispered his parents' names not for comfort, but to remind himself of his purpose. "Mother, father, I'm still here," he murmured, his voice hoarse. The sigil, though cracked and tarnished, was his only tie to the past, to the oath that burned in his heart. Once, desperate for warmth, Jack slipped into a roadside inn, crouching near the hearth in a shadowed corner. He hoped to go unnoticed, but the innkeeper spotted him. "Filthy beggar!" the man roared, seizing a broom and striking Jack's back. The blow sent him sprawling, pain flaring through his ribs, but he bit his lip to stifle a cry. The innkeeper kicked him out into the snow, the door slamming shut as patrons watched with indifferent eyes. Jack rose, snow clinging to his cloak, and walked into the night, the sigil still clutched in his bleeding hand. He did not beg, did not fight back. The humiliation, he knew, could not be washed away with words or tears. Days blurred into weeks, and Jack trudged miles to reach new villages, hoping for work in exchange for food. But the pattern repeated. Suspicious glances, muttered insults, doors closed in his face. A farmer once hired him to haul stones, but upon learning Jack had no family, no name, the man drove him off, tossing a few copper coins into the dirt as if they were alms. Children in one village chased him with rocks, shouting, "Thief!" though he had only asked for water. One night, Jack sat beneath a barren tree, 3 days without food, gnawing on a rotten potato scavenged from a refuse pile. The bitter taste filled his mouth, but he swallowed, because survival was all he had left. In a blizzard that swept through a remote mountain pass, Jack collapsed against a rocky outcrop, his body numb, his strength fading. Starving and frostbitten, he drank from a muddy puddle of melted snow, willing himself to endure the night. The wind howled, mocking his frailty, and he lay curled against the stone, the sigil pressed to his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered, thinking of his parents. "I tried." But even in despair, he refused to weep. Tears were a luxury he could not afford. The shame he carried could only be cleansed with blood and will. Over time, Jack learned to endure. He took grueling jobs where no one asked questions, hauling rocks, chopping wood, cleaning stables. His hands grew calloused, his frame, though lean, hardened with each labor. Once, working in a forge, a red-hot iron slipped, searing his hand until it blistered and bled. He gritted his teeth, wrapped it in rags, and continued, the pain a reminder of his purpose. An old, crippled man once let him shelter in a barn corner through a brutal winter, in exchange for daily woodcutting. Jack asked for nothing more, only to live, to breathe, to keep the chance to return alive. In those months of exile, Jack encountered all manner of souls, rare kindnesses, deceivers, exploiters. A farmer shared a loaf of bread, but thugs stole his last scraps, beating him until he bled. From these trials, he learned to read eyes, to sense lies, to survive in a world that favored the strong. He was no longer the naive boy of Stormvale's halls. He was a survivor, forged by pain and scorn, his heart a furnace where the oath burned unquenched. Each night beneath cold skies, he held the sigil and repeated his vow. "I will return," he whispered, "not as the outcast, but as the storm." The flame within him, though faint, never faltered, waiting to blaze forth and consume those who had cast him out. Chapter 2: The Hidden Master. Rain poured in relentless sheets, cloaking the ancient forest at the western frontier in a veil of darkness. Lightning split the sky, illuminating gnarled trees that twisted like specters clawing at the heavens. Thunder rolled, a primal growl mingling with the wail of wind tearing through branches. Beneath a moss-slicked outcrop, Jack lay sprawled, his 15-year-old body broken and battered. His cloak, tattered and soaked, clung to his gaunt frame, offering no shield against the storm's fury. For 3 days he had wandered without food or rest, driven by sheer will through desolate trails, seeking anything, a scrap of shelter, a morsel, a flicker of hope. But this land, whispered to be the haunt of demons, offered only cold and oblivion. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one fainter like a candle guttering in the gale. His hand, though numb, clung to the broken eagle sigil, its jagged edges biting into his palm, the last remnant of Stormvale, of the oath he swore by his parents' icy graves. Jack's eyes fluttered, heavy with exhaustion as the world blurred into shadow. His pulse slowed, a faint rhythm fading into silence. "This is the end," he thought, not with fear, but with weary surrender. "Mother, father, I tried." His fingers tightened around the sigil, its sharp points drawing blood that mingled with the rain, a final testament to a vow unfulfilled. Darkness closed in, and he felt himself sinking, as if the earth were claiming him for its own eternal rest. But as life ebbed, a warmth pierced his chest, not the fleeting heat of a fire, but something deeper, a spark kindling in the void. A firm hand pressed against his heart, and a strange energy flowed through him, coaxing his faltering pulse back to strength. Jack's eyes snapped open, his breath ragged. Before him stood an old man, his hair and beard white as snow, his eyes deep and ancient, like seas that had witnessed the birth of mountains. His gaze held neither anger nor pity, only a quiet wisdom, as if he had endured centuries of winters without speaking a word. Clad in a worn black cloak that blended with the night, he exuded a presence that seemed to still even the storm's rage. "Want to live, boy?" the old man asked, his voice low and steady, cutting through the rain's roar. Jack, too weak to rise, nodded faintly. "Want revenge?" The man's eyes sharpened, probing Jack's soul. Jack nodded again, a spark of defiance flaring in his gaze. "Want to be stronger than those who betrayed you?" This time, Jack did not nod. His hand clenched the sigil, its edges slicing deeper into his flesh, blood dripping to the ground. The old man's lips curled into a bitter, knowing smile, as if he had unearthed a raw gem from ashes. "Good," he said. "You have will, but will alone won't suffice. I can teach you, but you must shed your former self. You will bleed, break, beg for death. Will you pay that price?" Jack met the man's gaze, and in that moment he saw not just a teacher, but a soul scarred by betrayal, forged in the same crucible of pain that now consumed him. "I died the day they took my name," Jack rasped, his voice raw but unyielding. "Now I want to live to make the world bow." The old man nodded, no further words needed. He pulled Jack to his feet, his grip strong despite his age, and led him through the storm, as if the elements parted before him. The old man brought Jack to a cave hidden behind a cascading waterfall, its entrance veiled by stone and moss. Inside, the cavern was vast yet sparse, lit by a small fire crackling on the stone floor. A few animal hides served as bedding, and rusted swords hung on the walls, their blades dulled but radiating a lethal aura. The man called himself Varen, offering no tales of his past, but his bearing, his grip on a blade, the weight in his eyes, spoke of a warrior once revered, now forgotten or erased by the world. "I don't train you out of pity," Varen said that first night, as they sat by the fire's dim glow. "I train you because I see in you what the world stole from me, a spirit that refuses to kneel. But if you falter, I'll cast you out as they did." Training began at dawn, merciless and unrelenting. Varen offered no comforts, no soft bed, no hearty meals. Jack's food was bitter roots, tough game, and icy stream water. Sleep, when permitted, was a few hours on the cave's cold floor. On the first morning, Varen led Jack to a freezing stream, its current swift and biting. "Run against it," he commanded, standing on the bank, his eyes unyielding. Jack waded in, the water stabbing his chest like knives, and ran, his legs buckling under the force. He fell, gasping, the cold searing his lungs, but Varen's voice cut through. "Breath is power. Lose it, and you die." Jack rose, teeth gritted, and ran again, blood seeping from his torn feet. Each fall fueled his resolve, memories of hunger, scorn, and his oath driving him forward. This pain, he told himself, was the forge for the storm he would become. Varen taught Jack to see the world as a warrior. He made him stand for hours on a cliff's edge, eyes closed, listening to the wind to predict a falling leaf's path. "Your enemies aren't just men," Varen said. "Earth, sky, shadow, they'll kill you if you don't know them." Jack learned to fight in the cave's pitch-black depths, guided only by Varen's faint footsteps. The first time he fell under a wooden sword's blow, its tip at his throat. "You're dead," Varen said coldly. Again. Jack rose, and again, until he began to sense movement in the dark, to dodge by instinct, to strike where no eye could see. Days bled into months, and Jack's training honed not just his body, but his mind. Varen taught patience, the art of reading hearts. "The deadliest foe isn't the strongest," he said, "but the one who hides intent." He shared fragments of stories, empires that betrayed their champions, warriors cast into oblivion, as if speaking of himself. Jack did not pry, but he felt the weight of Varen's pain, and it steeled his resolve. If a legend like Varen could be broken by the world, then he, a nameless outcast, must become unbreakable. One night, after months of relentless drills, Varen led Jack deep into the cave to an old forge nestled among the stones. "Forge your sword," he said, tossing Jack a rough bar of steel. "Not for pride, but to carve your oath into it." Jack worked through the night, hammering the glowing metal, sweat mingling with tears, not of weakness, but of memory. He saw his parents' coffins, heard Magnus's verdict, felt the sting of stones thrown in exile. At dawn, the sword was done, its blade sharp and cold, etched with an eagle, wings spread wide. Jack held it, its weight not just in his hands, but in his soul. "This isn't a weapon," Varen said, his eyes glinting with rare approval. "It's your will." Years passed in the crucible of pain. Jack's body grew lean and muscled, marked by scars from countless trials. His hands, once soft, were calloused, wielding the sword with deadly precision. His eyes, once clouded by grief, burned with a clarity that unnerved even Varen. The old man taught him to survive, to hear an enemy's heartbeat, to sever a vein without a trace, to move silent as a shadow through the wild. Above all, he taught control. "Power isn't for boasting," Varen said. "It's justice for the weak, like you were, like I was." One winter morning, after 3 years, Jack stood atop a mountain, gazing east where the sun rose behind Stormvale's distant walls. His sword hung at his side, its eagle sigil gleaming like a vow renewed. Varen stood behind, his voice a low rumble. "Is it time?" Jack did not answer at once. He saw the city that cast him out, the graves of his parents, the face of Magnus. The fire within him, kindled by loss, had grown into a tempest, ready to sweep away all in its path. "Soon," he said, his voice steady, unyielding. "They'll know my name again, not as the outcast, but as the storm they cannot stop." Jack was no longer the broken boy of exile. He was a warrior forged in agony, tempered by will, guided by an oath that never wavered. Varen watched him, silent, but his eyes held a flicker, not of pride, but of recognition. His pupil was ready, and the world, unaware, was about to face a soul that could not be subdued. Chapter 3: The Return. The winter sky over the ether and mountains hung heavy with gray clouds, as if the heavens themselves braced for a coming storm. Jack, now 20, stood atop a windswept ridge, his gaze fixed eastward where the faint outline of Stormvale's stone walls pierced the horizon. His black cloak billowed in the icy gusts, the reforged eagle sigil on his chest glinting like a silent challenge. At his side hung the sword he had forged with Varen, its blade etched with an eagle, wings spread wide, a testament to the oath that had sustained him through years of exile and toil. His body, once frail, was now lean and muscled, marked by scars that told of countless trials. His eyes, once clouded by grief, burned with a quiet intensity, a blade's edge tempered by loss and resolve. He was no longer the boy cast out by his clan. He was a warrior, a force forged in the crucible of pain, ready to reclaim what was stolen, not just his name, but the honor of Stormvale itself. Varen, his mentor, stood a few paces back, his white hair whipping in the wind, his ancient eyes studying his pupil. "Is it time?" he asked, his voice a low rumble carrying the weight of one who had seen empires fall. Jack did not answer immediately. His mind drifted to the memories that haunted him, the icy coffins of his parents, the scornful whispers in the great hall, the gates slamming shut behind him. But those years of training under Varen had taught him more than swordplay. They had taught him patience, the art of seeing hearts, the strength to turn pain into purpose. The fire of his oath, kindled beside his parents' graves, had grown into a tempest, but he knew it must be wielded with precision, not unleashed in blind fury. "Soon," he said, his voice steady, unyielding. "They'll know my name again, not as the outcast, but as the storm they cannot hold back." Varen nodded, a rare flicker of approval in his gaze. He had given Jack all he could, skill, wisdom, the means to survive a world that broke the weak. "Go," he said. "But remember, vengeance is a spark. Justice is the fire that endures." Jack gripped his sword's hilt, the weight grounding him, and gave a single nod. With a final glance at his mentor, he descended the ridge, his steps sure and deliberate, each one carrying him closer to the city that had forsaken him. The gates of Stormville loomed as they had 5 years ago, their massive stones carved with the red eagle, now weathered and faded, a shadow of the clan's former glory. The guards, clad in gray armor, eyed Jack warily as he approached, their hands resting on sword hilts. His black cloak and the blade at his side marked him as no ordinary traveler, yet his face, hardened but faintly familiar, stirred unease. "Who are you?" one guard demanded, his voice gruff. Jack stopped, his gaze calm but piercing, like a blade held steady. "I am Jack," he said, his words clear, devoid of arrogance but heavy with purpose. "I've come to take back what's mine." The guard hesitated, sensing something in Jack's presence that stilled his hand, and stepped aside, allowing him to pass. Word of Jack's return spread through Stormville like wildfire. Townsfolk gathered in the snow-dusted streets, whispering as he strode through the city. Some recognized the boy who had been cast out, their faces etched with doubt. "That's the weakling," a blacksmith muttered, his voice laced with skepticism. "What can he do?" But others, especially the downtrodden, the farmers burdened by taxes, the orphans scavenging in alleys, saw something else. They saw the strength in his stride, the fire in his eyes, the quiet dignity of one who had faced the abyss and emerged unbroken. An old woman by a vegetable stall leaned toward her grandson, her voice low. "Look at his eyes, child. Those aren't the eyes of a failure." Jack did not linger to hear the murmurs. He moved through the city with purpose, his path leading toward the central market, where narrow streets converged on the great stone hall of Stormville. But before he could reach it, he paused at a corner where a ragged child, no older than 10, cowered under the shouts of a drunken brute. The man raised a fist, ready to strike, but Jack stepped forward, swift as a shadow, catching the man's wrist mid-swing. "Enough," Jack said, his voice low but commanding, like a blade pressed to flesh. The drunk, twice Jack's size, roared and tried to wrench free, but Jack's grip held firm, his eyes cold as winter ice. The man shuddered, his bravado crumbling, and muttered a curse before stumbling away. Jack knelt, offering the child a piece of bread from his pack. "Eat," he said softly. The child stared, wide-eyed, then nodded, clutching the bread like a treasure. The crowd watching from the market's edge murmured, and the tale of the stranger who protected the weak began to spread, planting a seed of hope in hearts long starved for it. In the great stone hall, the council of elders convened in haste, the air thick with tension. Magnus, older now, his silver hair thinner, sat at the head, his hands gripping the arms of his stone chair. His face, once commanding, was pale, his eyes darting with a mix of fear and fury as news of Jack's return reached him. "He dares come back," he bellowed, his fist slamming the chair, the sound echoing like a crack of thunder. "That failure has no place here," an elder, his voice trembling, replied. "He's no boy now, my lord. They say he moves like a specter, fights like a demon." "The people are talking of him." Magnus's jaw tightened, his gaze burning with a desperate rage. "Summon the full council," he ordered. "I'll crush him again as I did before." But Jack did not rush to confront Magnus or storm the hall with drawn sword. Varen's teachings had ingrained in him that raw strength alone would not restore honor. Wisdom and patience were sharper blades. Instead, he began with the people, those the clan had forgotten. He helped a farmer mend a barn roof torn by wind, asking no payment. He stood between a young woman and a group of drunken soldiers, disarming them with bare hands, his movements swift and precise, without spilling blood. Each act, though small, rippled through the city. The poor began to call him the returned. not with fear, but with reverence, their voices carrying tales of a man who fought for those without hope. Jack was no fool. He knew Magnus would not sit idle, that the council would seek to destroy him before his influence grew. One night, as he rested in a modest inn on the city's outskirts, 3 assassins crept into his room, their daggers gleaming under moonlight. Sent by an elder loyal to Magnus, they aimed to end Jack before he became a threat. But Jack, trained by Varen to hear the heartbeat of a foe, woke the moment their shadows crossed the threshold. In the dark, he moved like a wraith, dodging the first blade, disarming the second with a twist of the wrist, and felling the third with a single blow. The assassins lay groaning on the floor, their mission shattered before they could strike. Jack stood over them, his sword still sheathed, his eyes glinting like steel. "Tell your master," he said, his voice cold, "that I'm not so easily killed." One assassin, trembling, nodded and fled with his companions, their failure a warning that echoed through the city's underbelly. In the days that followed, Jack turned his attention to the council, not with violence but with cunning. At a public gathering in the city square where elders heard disputes, Jack stepped forward, his cloak swaying in the wind. The crowd hushed, all eyes on him. A wealthy merchant and ally of Magnus was accusing a poor farmer of unpaid debts, demanding his land as forfeit. Jack spoke, his voice clear and resonant. "How much does he owe?" he asked. The merchant, caught off guard but smug, replied, 50 silver coins, a debt he'll never repay." Jack drew a small pouch from his cloak, filled with coins earned from odd jobs, and set it before the merchant. "Here's 30, he said. "Consider it partial payment. For the rest, prove the debt isn't a trap." The crowd murmured, the merchant faltered. Jack pressed on, his tone calm but cutting. "You doubled the interest, cornered this man to steal his land. I've seen your ledgers, ones you thought hidden." He held up a small book, obtained from a smuggler who had worked for the merchant. The crowd gasped, the merchant stammered, his face draining of color. An elder, forced to maintain appearances, declared the debt void. The farmer, tears in his eyes, thanked Jack, and the crowd roared, their cheers a tide of newfound belief. Jack did not smile. He glanced at Magnus, watching from the dais, his face a mask of barely contained rage, and knew the elder's power was slipping. Jack's actions began to fracture the council's hold. Young nobles, disillusioned by Magnus's tyranny, sought him out. Cale, a warrior who had once mocked Jack in his youth, approached him one evening, head bowed. "I was wrong," Cale said, his voice heavy. "You're no weakling. If you fight for Stormville, I'll stand with you." Jack studied him, his gaze neither forgiving nor condemning. "I don't need loyalty born of fear," he said. "Prove your worth." Cale nodded, and from that day he became the first of Jack's allies, his sword pledged to a new vision. Magnus, however, grew desperate. He gathered his loyalists, plotting to eliminate Jack before he could sway more hearts. One evening, as Jack crossed a forest near the city, a band of gray-clad warriors ambushed him, their blades drawn under the moon's pale light. They were Magnus's finest, ordered to slay Jack and leave his body for the wolves. But Jack, honed by Varen's relentless drills, vanished into the trees, using shadow and stone to his advantage. He struck silently, disarming one, felling another, until the last warrior knelt, swordless, trembling. "Go back to Magnus," Jack said, his voice like ice. "Tell him I'll face him, but on my terms." The warrior fled, his defeat a crack in the council's armor. Each victory, however small, wove Jack's legend. The people called him the Storm Returned, a name that carried both awe and fear. He fought not just for himself, but for those crushed by Stormville's rule, farmers stripped of land, children left to starve, families bowed under the council's greed. One night, standing on a hill overlooking the city, its torches flickering like stars, Jack felt the weight of his path. His oath to restore his parents' honor had grown into something greater. It was a vow to rebuild Stormville, to make it a bastion of justice. He gripped his sword, its eagle sigil a reminder of the boy he had been and the man he had become. "I'm not done," he whispered to himself, to his parents to the north. "Not until Stormville remembers what honor means." Above an eagle's sword, its cry sharp and clear, as if affirming the oath that burned unquenched in his heart. Chapter 4, The Reckoning. The night before the day that would decide his fate, Stormville lay shrouded in darkness, the sky a vast expanse of black, unbroken by stars. A cold wind swept through the ancient forests encircling the city, its howl carrying whispers of a past heavy with betrayal. Jack stood alone on a hill overlooking the stone walls, their torchlit battlements flickering like wary eyes in the night. His black cloak stirred in the gusts, the reforged eagle sigil on his chest catching the faint moonlight, a symbol of the vow that had carried him through 5 years of exile, hardship, and transformation. The sword at his side, its blade etched with an eagle's spread wings, gleamed with a quiet menace, mirroring the resolve in his heart, a heart scarred yet unbroken, burning with purpose. At 20, Jack was no longer the frail boy who had knelt by his parents' icy graves. He was a warrior, forged in the crucible of Varen's teachings, tempered by loss and driven by an oath that had grown beyond vengeance into a vision of justice. The memories of those 5 years flooded his mind. The scornful whispers at his parents' funeral, the council's verdict stripping him of his name, the hunger and cold of exile, the relentless training that had reshaped him. But his return to Stormville had changed him further, helping the downtrodden, outwitting the corrupt, and winning the hearts of those who once doubted him had expanded his oath. It was no longer just about restoring his parents' honor or making their betrayers pay. It was about rebuilding Stormville, turning a city ruled by greed and fear into a bastion where the weak could stand tall. Tomorrow, he would enter the great stone hall where his exile began, face Magnus, and bring the truth to light. Not to claim a throne, but to fulfill the promise he had whispered beside the cold graves. Jack gripped his sword's hilt, its weight a reminder of the boy he had been and the man he had become. "This ends now," he murmured to himself, to his parents, to the north. At dawn, the great stone hall of Stormville was filled to bursting, its ancient walls trembling under the weight of anticipation. Townsfolk, nobles, warriors, and elders packed the vast chamber, their murmurs a low hum like the gathering of a storm. The walls, carved with reliefs of warriors wielding blades in eternal battle, seemed to watch, as if the clan's storied past held its breath for what was to come. The torches burned fiercely, their light dancing across the stone, but they could not dispel the tension that hung heavy in the air. Magnus sat at the head of the council, his silver hair thinner, his once commanding presence diminished by years of paranoia and greed. His hands clutched the arms of his high stone chair, knuckles white, his eyes darting with a mix of fear and defiance. The elders loyal to him whispered nervously, their hands hovering near sword hilts, while others, swayed by Jack's actions in the city, sat uneasy, their allegiance wavering. Among the crowd, the poor, farmers, laborers, orphans, stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes alight with hope, whispering the name of the storm returned. The heavy stone doors groaned open, and Jack stepped into the hall. His black cloak flowed behind him, the eagle's sigil on his chest gleaming like a beacon. His sword remained sheathed, but his presence alone silenced the crowd, a force as undeniable as the wind that battered the ether and peaks. Every eye followed him as he strode to the center of the hall, standing before the council's raised dais, where he had once knelt as a boy to face exile. But now he stood unbowed, his gaze locked on Magnus, calm yet piercing, the look of a man who had faced death and emerged stronger. The crowd parted, leaving him alone before the elders, a solitary figure against the weight of history. Yet this time, Jack was not alone in spirit. The murmurs of the people, the loyalty of allies like Kale carried him forward. Magnus rose, his voice booming but brittle, betraying the fear beneath his bluster. "You dare return, Jack?" he roared, pointing a trembling finger. "You who bear no bludgift, no honor, no right to stand in this hall. You are a ghost, a relic of a name long dead." The crowd stirred, some nobles nodding in agreement, their voices low with scorn. But the townsfolk remained silent, waiting for Jack to speak, their faith in him a quiet strength that Magnus could not ignore. Jack stepped closer, his voice clear and resonant, cutting through the hall like a blade through mist. "I come not for your throne," he said, his eyes never leaving Magnus. "I come for the truth. For my parents whom you called heroes yet betrayed, for every soul you've crushed to cling to your power." His words struck like thunder, silencing the whispers, freezing the elders in their seats. Magnus's face paled, his hands shaking, but he forced a sneer. "Lies," he spat. "You have no proof, only the ravings of a failure." Jack did not flinch. From his cloak he drew a small, leather-bound book, its pages worn and stained, and held it aloft for all to see. "This is proof," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "Letters, secret orders, written in your hand, Magnus. You conspired with enemies, luring my parents to a battle they could not win. You let them die to seize Stormville for yourself, to twist its honor into a tool for your greed." He opened the book, reading aloud, each word a hammer blow. "On the 17th day of the cold wind," Magnus wrote, "let them fall in the valley of shadows. With them gone, Stormville is mine." The hall erupted, gasps and cries rising like a tide. The townsfolk roared, their voices a chorus of outrage. "He killed our heroes," a farmer shouted. "Justice for them," a woman wept. An elder loyal to Magnus leapt to his feet, face flushed. "Falsehoods! How could you have such a thing?" Jack's gaze turned to him, cold as winter's heart. "I took it from your hidden archives where you thought no one would dare look. A smuggler in your employ sold it to me, sickened by your crimes." The crowd's anger swelled, their shouts drowning out the protests of Magnus's allies. The elders wavered, their loyalty cracking under the weight of the truth. Magnus staggered back, his face ashen, his lips moving soundlessly. His allies rose, hands on swords, but their eyes flickered with doubt. The townsfolk pressed forward, their voices a wall of defiance, and Jack's allies, Cale and other young warriors, stepped out, blades drawn, pledging their stand. Cale knelt before Jack, his voice ringing clear. "I am with you," he declared. Others followed, their swords raised, their loyalty a spark igniting the crowd. The hall thundered with the chant of Jack's name, a tide that Magnus could not stem. In desperation, Magnus drew his long sword, its blade flashing under the torchlight, and pointed it at Jack. "If you seek justice, take it with steel," he bellowed, his voice cracking with fear and rage. "Face me, you worthless cur, and prove your worth." The crowd fell silent, every eye on Jack. He regarded Magnus, his expression unyielding but tinged with sorrow. "I came not to kill you," he said, "but if this is the only way to end it, so be it." He drew his sword, the eagle sigil gleaming, and stepped into the center of the hall, ready. The duel began, fierce and swift, a clash of wills as much as blades. Magnus, though aged, was a seasoned swordsman, his strikes heavy and precise, aimed to kill. His sword arced toward Jack's chest, each blow driven by years of ambition and fear. But Jack, forged by Varen's relentless training, moved like a shadow, his blade parrying with deadly calm. The clang of steel echoed through the hall, a song of fury and redemption. The crowd held its breath, the townsfolk clutching each other, the elders frozen, unable to look away from Jack's speed and skill. Magnus fought with savage intensity, but his strikes grew reckless, fueled by desperation. Jack watched, waited, and when Magnus overreached with a wild swing, Jack spun, knocking the elder's sword from his grasp. The blade clattered to the stone floor, its ring a death knell. Jack advanced, his sword at Magnus's throat, forcing him to his knees. The hall was silent, save for Magnus's labored breaths. Finish it, Magnus snarled, his voice a mix of terror and defiance. Kill me as you swore. Jack held his gaze, his sword steady, but his eyes held no hatred, only a deep, weary sadness. I swore to restore my parents' honor, he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall. Killing you isn't justice. You will live, Magnus, live with the shame of betraying your kin, your clan, your north. Live to see what you destroyed rebuilt. He sheathed his sword, turning to the crowd. Justice isn't blood, it's truth, honor, and what we build from this day forward. The hall exploded, the townsfolk's cheers a wave crashing against the stone. They chanted Jack's name not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of hope. The elders, even those once loyal to Magnus, rose, some bowing their heads in respect. One, his voice trembling, spoke. You've proven your worth, Jack. Stormville needs you. Magnus, still kneeling, was seized by warriors and dragged from the hall, his eyes hollow, a man stripped of all he had coveted. Jack did not watch him go. He knew Magnus would be exiled, condemned to wander with his guilt, a fate heavier than death. In the days that followed, Jack refused the high chair in the great hall. He declined the title of clan leader, the throne Magnus had craved. Instead, he called for a new council, one where voices from all walks, farmers, artisans, warriors, would be heard. Stormville needs no king, he said, standing in the city square, his eyes bright with conviction. It needs justice, honor, and those who will shield the weak. The crowd roared, their faith aflame, kindled by his words, and for the first time in years, the city felt the warmth of unity. Jack set to work rebuilding Stormville. He oversaw the redistribution of land to farmers, ensuring none went hungry. He opened a training school for orphans, teaching them not just to fight, but to live with courage. The city's stone walls were repaired, not as barriers of power, but as symbols of strength shared by all. Kale and other young warriors became his trusted allies, spreading his vision across the north. Yet Jack never forgot his roots. One quiet afternoon, he visited his parents' graves, placing a new eagle sigil forged from pure steel on the stone. I did it, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Your honor is restored. Standing on a cliff overlooking Stormville, Jack watched the city glow under the sun, its shadows banished. An eagle soared above, its cry sharp and free, echoing his journey's end. The oath by the cold grave was fulfilled, but Jack's mission endured. His path had been not just vengeance, but redemption for his parents, his people, himself. Stormville would never forget the storm that rose from a boy's broken heart, nor the man who made it whole again. Chapter 5. A Legacy Reborn. The sun rose over Stormville, its golden light spilling across the stone walls, banishing the shadows that had clung to the city for too long. The ether and mountains stood sentinel in the distance, their snow-capped peaks gleaming under a sky streaked with dawn's first colors. The air, once heavy with the bite of winter, carried a faint warmth, a promise of spring stirring in the north. From a cliff overlooking the city, Jack gazed down at the bustling streets below, where the rhythm of life had changed. Smoke rose from hearths, laughter echoed from market stalls, and children ran through alleys, their voices free of fear. The Red Eagle banners, once tattered symbols of a fractured clan, flew proudly atop the ramparts, their wings spread wide, reborn like the city itself. Jack, now 22, stood tall, his black cloak stirring in the breeze, the reforged eagle sigil on his chest catching the light. His sword, etched with the same emblem, hung at his side, its blade silent but ever ready, a reminder of the oath that had shaped his path. 2 years had passed since the day in the great stone hall when Jack faced Magnus, exposing his betrayal and reclaiming the honor of his parents. That day, he had refused the throne, choosing instead to forge a new Stormville, a city not ruled by a single hand, but guided by a council where every voice, from farmer to warrior, held weight. The memory of that moment, of the crowd's cheers and the weight of his parents' restored legacy, lingered in his heart, but it was tempered by the work that followed. Rebuilding a city was no simple task, and healing a people broken by years of greed and fear was harder still. Yet Jack had not wavered, driven by the same fire that had kindled his oath beside the cold graves, a fire that now burned not for vengeance, but for redemption, for a future where no child would know the pain of exile he had endured. Stormvale had flourished under his guidance. The fields beyond the walls, once barren from overtaxation, now bloomed with golden wheat, tended by farmers who owned their land. The market square, once a place of whispered deals and desperate barter, thrummed with life, its stalls laden with goods from across the north. The training grounds, where Jack had once faltered as a boy, echoed with the clash of wooden swords, as orphans and outcasts learned not just to fight, but to stand with honor. The great stone hall, no longer a fortress of power, opened its doors to all, its council chambers filled with voices debating laws, trade, and the city's future. The red eagle, once a mark of elitism, had become a symbol of unity, its image carved into new homes, sewn onto cloaks, and whispered in tales told by firelight. Jack's hand rested on his sword's hilt, his fingers tracing the eagle's wings. He thought of his parents, their faces clear in his memory despite the years. He had visited their graves often, placing a new sigil, forged from pure steel on the stone, a silent promise kept. "You'd be proud," he murmured, his voice soft, carried away by the wind. But pride was not enough. The work was unfinished, and Jack knew the North was vast, its challenges unending. Whispers reached Stormville of unrest in distant lands, warlords rising in the east, villages raided in the west. The city's newfound strength would be tested, and Jack felt the weight of that responsibility, not as a burden, but as a call to continue what he had begun. As he stood on the cliff, a young girl approached, no older than 12, her dark hair tied back, a wooden sword strapped to her side. Her name was Ilara, one of the first orphans Jack had taken under his wing at the training school. Her eyes, bright and fierce, reminded him of himself at her age, though her spirit burned without the shadow of betrayal he had carried. "Master Jack," she said, her voice steady despite her youth, "the council's meeting soon. They're asking for you." Jack turned, a faint smile touching his lips. "Not Master, Ilara, just Jack." She grinned, unapologetic, and he saw in her the future of Stormville, a generation unbound by the past, shaped by the ideals he had fought for. They descended the cliff together, Ilara chattering about her latest sparring match, her words a reminder of how far the city had come. As they entered the streets, townsfolk greeted Jack with nods and smiles, their faces no longer etched with fear. A baker pressed a warm loaf into his hands, a weaver offered a new cloak, and children trailed behind, whispering tales of the storm returned. Jack accepted their kindness with quiet gratitude, but his eyes scanned the city, noting the work still needed. Homes to repair, defenses to strengthen, hearts to mend. He had learned from Varen that true strength lay not in conquest, but in endurance, in building something that outlasted the builder. The great stone hall was alive with voices when Jack arrived. The council, a mix of elders, warriors, and common folk, debated a trade agreement with a neighboring city. Jack took his seat, not at the head, but among them, a choice that spoke louder than any title. Ilara stood nearby, watching with keen interest, her presence a reminder that the young were learning, preparing to carry the city forward. The discussion turned to rumors of raiders in the west, and Jack listened, his mind already weighing strategies. "We'll send scouts," he suggested, his voice calm but firm. "If the threat is real, we'll aid those villages, not just defend our own." The council nodded, their trust in him unspoken but absolute. He was no ruler, but his vision guided them, a compass for a city finding its way. After the meeting, Jack walked to the training grounds, where Alara and other students practiced under Kale's watchful eye. Kale, once a skeptic, had become Jack's staunchest ally, his sword and heart pledged to Stormville's new path. "They're improving," Kale said, nodding toward the students. "Alara's the best of them, stubborn like someone I know." Jack chuckled, watching Alara spar, her movements quick and precise. He saw in her, in all of them, the seeds of a Stormville that would endure, a city where strength was measured not by bludgift, but by will and compassion. As dusk fell, Jack returned to the cliff, a ritual he had kept since his return. The city below glowed with torchlight, its heartbeat steady and strong. He thought of Varen, wondering where the old warrior was now, whether he watched from some distant peak. Varen's lessons, patience, perception, the power of justice, lived in every choice Jack made. He thought of Magnus, exiled and broken, a shadow of the man who had once cast him out. Magnus's fate, to live with his shame, was a justice harsher than death, a reminder that true victory was not in destruction, but in creation. Alara joined him, her wooden sword still at her side. "Why do you come here every night?" she asked, her curiosity unbridled. Jack looked at her, then at the city. "To remember," he said, "not just the pain, but why I fought. Why we still fight." She nodded, her young face serious, and he saw she understood in her own way. "Will you teach me to be like you?" she asked. Jack smiled, a rare warmth softening his features. "No," he said, "I'll teach you to be better." The wind carried an eagle's cry, sharp and clear, as it soared above the city. Jack watched it, its wings cutting through the twilight, a mirror of the freedom he had won, not just for himself, but for Stormville. The oath by the cold grave had been fulfilled, its fire now a beacon for others. Yet Jack knew his journey was not over. The North was vast, its trials unending, and he would face them not as a lone warrior, but as part of a city united. He placed a hand on Alara's shoulder, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Come," he said, "there's work to do." Stormville would remember Jack, not as the outcast who returned, but as the man who reshaped its soul. His legacy was not in stone or steel, but in the hearts of those he inspired, in the children like Alara who would carry his vision forward. The North would tell his story of a boy whose heart broke beside a grave and a man whose will rebuilt a world. And as the eagle vanished into the sky, its cry lingered, a testament to an oath that would never fade.